the trick-or-treater. Every Halloween, Mrs. Jenkins would expect the same knock on her door, right as the moon hit its highest point in the sky. The small figure would always appear dressed in a skeleton costume, holding a cracked plastic pumpkin bucket. He never arrived with the other kids who came in groups, laughing and shouting trick or treat. No, this boy came alone, long after the other children had gone home. He knocked softly, 3 times, always in the same way. And every year, Mrs. Jenkins would smile kindly, drop candy into his bucket, and watch as he silently walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Something about him had always unsettled her. He never spoke a word, no cheerful thank you, no sound at all. His mask, an old, faded skull, was too big for his small frame, and his costume seemed worn, almost as if it had been passed down for many years. But it was the silence that bothered her the most. It was unnatural, too heavy for a child. Still, she never questioned it. He was just one of the many trick-or-treaters, or so she told herself. This year, as Halloween approached, Mrs. Jenkins heard a story from a neighbour that sent chills down her spine. Decades ago, a boy from the neighbourhood had gone missing while trick-or-treating. He had been dressed as a skeleton that night. The details sent a shiver through her as she realised the eerie similarity. The boy was last seen in front of her house. He had knocked on her door, but when no one answered, he had wandered into the woods behind the house, never to be seen again. On the night of Halloween, Mrs. Jenkins tried to dismiss the story as a neighbourhood legend, something that had grown more exaggerated with time. But as midnight approached, she found herself on edge, watching the clock. Just as the hands struck 12, there it was, the familiar, soft knock. She froze, staring at the door, her heart racing. She had never been afraid to open it before, but now dread settled over her. Slowly, she walked to the door, her hands trembling. She opened it just a crack, peering out, and there he was, the same small boy, in the same ragged skeleton costume, standing in silence. Trick or treat, she forced herself to say, her voice barely a whisper. She dropped the candy into his bucket, expecting him to turn and walk away, just like he always did. But this time he didn't move. He stood there, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if waiting for something. "Is there something else?" she asked, her voice wavering. Suddenly, the boy reached out and grabbed her hand. His touch was icy, like touching something dead and long forgotten. Mrs. Jenkins gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. Her breath caught in her throat as he whispered, his voice low and raspy, "Help me." Shaking, she yanked her hand back and stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. Her heart pounded in her chest, the words echoing in her mind. She ran to the window and looked out, but the boy was gone, or so she thought. She tried to calm herself down, convincing herself it was just a cruel prank. But the words wouldn't leave her mind. Help me. What had he meant? Why her? After hours of restlessness, unable to sleep, Mrs. Jenkins made a decision. She put on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and ventured into the woods behind her house, where the boy had supposedly vanished so many years ago. The woods were darker than she remembered, the trees closing in around her as the wind whispered through the branches. She followed the faint trail until she stumbled upon an old well, half hidden by overgrown vines. The cold night air seemed to hold its breath as she approached. The well looked ancient, forgotten by time. She felt a chill run down her spine. Was this where the boy had disappeared? Kneeling down, she shone her flashlight into the well's black, empty depths. She saw nothing but shadows, yet the air around her seemed to thicken, almost as if the past was reaching out to her. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the trees, and in it she heard the faintest whisper, "Help me." Her heart ached with understanding. The boy had never left. He had been trapped here all these years, lost, waiting for someone to hear him. With trembling hands, Mrs. Jenkins stood and called into the well, "I'm here. I'll help you." For a moment, there was only silence, And then the wind shifted. The woods seemed to grow lighter, the oppressive darkness lifting just a bit. The chill that had surrounded her began to fade, and for the first time that night, Mrs. Jenkins felt at peace. She hurried home and, fueled by a sense of urgency, phoned the authorities. She recounted the story of the boy, the whispers she had heard, and the well she had found. The police took her seriously, sending a team to investigate the woods. The next day they drained the well, and as the water receded, they discovered a small, lifeless body at the bottom. The news spread quickly through the community, and the sorrow was palpable. Mrs. Jenkins stood at the edge of the crowd gathered outside the well, tears streaming down her face, knowing she had finally given the boy the peace he had long sought. That Halloween night, as the boy's spirit was laid to rest, Mrs. Jenkins felt a warmth envelop her, a gentle breeze that carried away the lingering chill. The boy's presence faded, but she knew he was finally free. The familiar knock on her door never came again, and the shadow of the past was lifted from her home. From that day forward, every Halloween, Mrs. Jenkins would leave a candy at the doorstep, a small tribute to the boy who had been lost but was now at peace. The end. Subscribe to Halo 360 for more.